Welcome friends to At Home with Theosophy. We are starting today a new series. The title is The Laws of the Higher Life, and it includes a series of articles by Annie Besant on the higher life. Some of these articles were published in a small book with the title of the series, The Laws of the Higher Life, but I have included a couple more that complete the subject. So we will start today with a writing that is called Revelation, Inspiration, and Observation, because this, as we are going to see, sets the foundation for how do we relate to literature that talks about things that we may not perceive in a direct way. So when we study theosophical subjects or books or spiritual books per se, we are dealing with a series of information that that may be beyond what our perception can reach. So how do we relate to this? This is what we are going to explore today. So let us start with a little introduction. She says, those who seriously take up the study of theosophy should not be satisfied with the mere reading of the voluminous theosophical literature poured out into the world. They should, in addition, if they have any innate faculty for such investigation, prepare to develop the faculties by which they may verify for themselves that which they are told by others. Although in most cases it may not be possible to develop the subtle senses within the limits of the present incarnation, a good foundation may be laid for such development in the next incarnation. So the idea in the Theosophical tradition is not to take the readings as a piece of information that we have to take on faith. The ideal is that the student has to try to verify all these things. Of course, within the Theosophical literature, we have parts of the teachings that are easily verified, other aspects that can be verified with some work, and then there are other aspects that may be for the time being beyond the ability to perceive these things. As Annie Besant says here, they may require the development of higher senses that are not developed in the majority of humanity today. But the Theosophical tradition proposes a way of life that begins to awaken these spiritual senses. And since everything in nature needs to or happens gradually, the awakening of higher senses may not have happened in this incarnation, but it will happen in the future. If we never start with this process, then it will never happen. However, there is a lot that can be verified with with some work on our part, and that is normally the attitude that is recommended in the Theosophical tradition. Not merely read and discuss this. Many times scholars discuss philosophies, but with no intent on trying to actually practice what the philosophy says. It's just a question of discussing ideas. That is not what the Theosophical tradition aims at. And we don't want also to incorporate all this information merely as an item of faith, as I was saying. So we are encouraged to make an effort to think about what we read, to work with it intellectually, and try to see if we see the meaning that is behind the words, and then also start leading a life that helps us deepen our perception and our consciousness so that we can start experiencing some of the aspects of the Theosophical teaching. However, she says, before we can really become what in the Theosophical tradition is called an occultist, that means a person that is able to deal with all these hidden aspects of life, nature, and the forces. Before that, much theoretical study is desirable before passing on into the practical. Hence, theoretical study must form a large part of the training of every Theosophical student, and his attitude towards such a study is a matter of serious importance. So this is what we are going to see today. How do we relate? How do we study these teachings? And this idea of the study is, some people think that it's not applicable to spirituality, that we should jump into practices, but actually that is not necessarily wise. In any aspect in life, we first need to learn before we start doing. Whatever we do, let's suppose we study science, before going into a laboratory and beginning to do experiments, we go through a training where we acquire the theoretical knowledge so that we can actually do something that is meaningful as our understanding deepens. So similarly, in spirituality, we need to generate a theoretical foundation before we can start doing a work that is deep. Of course, if all our spirituality is simply either praying or watching our breathing or simple things like that, there is not much information that is necessary. But if we are going to go deeper and begin to try to awaken what Annie Besant calls the higher life, then much more of a theoretical foundation is necessary. Now, as Annie Besant says here, it is important to learn how to relate to the information that we are going to be facing, because as I mentioned, we will get in touch with information that we may not be able to verify at the moment. So how do we deal with it? So the first thing that Annie Besant says is that we need to discriminate between the books that we read and to suit the attitude to the type of the book. The aspirant must seek to understand what is meant by revelation, what by inspiration, and to distinguish revealed from inspired literature, and both from the records of observations. So as she's going to explain, our attitude is a little different when we deal with books that are supposed to come from a higher source, or books that are supposed to come from people more or less like us, but that were inspired, or books that are records of observations. And all this will become clearer as we move on. So she says, first, there is a knowledge which is eternally true. It is the knowledge of the Logos. The Logos is a word that is frequently used in Theosophical literature for the deity of a system, for the divine. So there is a knowledge that is eternally true, and it is the knowledge of the divine, the knowledge of the Lord of a universe, the knowledge of what is and not of what seems, the knowledge of realities and not of phenomena. This abides ever in the Logos, and it is part of himself or itself, however we want to put it. So the idea is that what we perceive normally are appearances. There is a reality that we are perceiving, but how we perceive that reality, how it looks to us, depends on basically how our body is designed. As I explained frequently in other webinars, what we call a color doesn't really exist out there in nature. A color is simply a wave, an electromagnetic wave that has no color per se. It's just an electromagnetic wave, as I was saying. And when that electromagnetic wave stimulates our eyes and the nerves, the brain interprets that stimulation, that is electrochemical, in with the form of what we call red or blue or whatever it is. But red and blue are not out there. The I don't know, the chair is not red, the chair has no color, but when the light bounces off the chair with this particular wave, it is interpreted in our brain as red. This is what is called phenomena, and this is something that Western philosophy and science have discovered since long ago. The idea that we perceive only appearances and not the things in themselves. Now, in the Theosophical view, there is the possibility of perceiving the thing in itself, the essence of something, but then we have to raise our consciousness to the divine levels, let's say. The mind of the Logos is actually the root of our own minds. So if we learn how to raise our minds to the foundation of our minds, to the root of our minds, we are at the level of the mind of the Logos, and then we can realize how things really are. Now, when we cannot do that, then we can learn about the real by what somebody who claimed to have seen can tell us. And that's where we come to the realm of study. So Annie Besant says that in its true form, the true knowledge is in the mind of the Logos, but in its manifested form, as revealed for the helping of humanity, it becomes the scriptures which are regarded as authoritative, which lie at the back of all the great religions. Scriptures go through many stages until finally little of the original knowledge remains. So the idea is that the founders of religions are human beings who have developed this ability to raise their consciousness to the divine levels, and then they tell us about that for the benefit of those who cannot do that yet. And then that becomes a scripture, as we are going to see in this class. The scriptures go through different processes, and often what we get is not exactly the same, and sometimes quite different from what the original teacher said. So again, the question is, how do we deal with these things? So Annie Besant gives an example in Hinduism. She says, all Hindu schools of philosophy acknowledge the supreme authority of the Vedas, which are the sacred scriptures in Hinduism. However, after this formal acknowledgement is made, the intellect is allowed to range freely at its will, to inquire, to judge, to speculate. Hinduism has ever left the human intellect free. In philosophy, in metaphysics, it has ever realized that truth should be sought, and no penalty inflicted on error. Error being sufficiently penalized by the fact that it is error and breeds misfortunes under natural laws. So this is something interesting in Hinduism. It is said that there are 6 orthodox schools of Hinduism, 6 schools that recognize the Vedas as the authority, as the truth. However, these 6 schools are quite different. One of them is materialistic, the other is deistic, the other is based on duality, the other is based on non-duality. Very different approaches, and they all claim to have the Vedas as their final authority, and they all live with each other. They are not like maybe in the Christian religion denouncing each other as being, right or wrong. Because, as Annie Besant says here, in Hinduism, there is a recognition that it is necessary to work with the information, to get to your own point of view, and that truth, ultimately speaking, is beyond any representation, so that there are different ways in which we can approach truth, and we may get to different presentations or views about what truth is. So this is something interesting, and I think Besant is bringing it up because that is also the Theosophical approach. In the Theosophical approach, we don't even claim that some scriptures are the final authority, as it happens with the Hindus, but the idea is the same, that we can all study seriously and then do our work, as we are going to see, and it's perfectly fine that we come to different points of view without the need to tell people what interpretations are orthodox and right and what other interpretations are wrong or are pseudo interpretations in a sense. So she says the Hindu divides all knowledge into two types, the supreme and the lower. In Sanskrit, they use paroksha and aparoksha. In the lower, he places all his sacred books, together with all literature, all science, all instruction. So all literature, even the one that is in the Vedas, in the Upanishads, in all the sacred books, are regarded as a lower kind of knowledge. Not because the information that is there may not be true, but because written expressions of truth are necessarily of a lower, let's say, it's a lower hierarchy or hierarchical place when we compare it with the perception of truth. It's like the difference between tasting something sweet and describing what a sweet flavor is. Necessarily, the description is not at the same level as the experience of sweetness. So similarly, even though the description may be very accurate, it is of a lower category than the direct perception of truth. Annie Besant says in the category of the supreme, the Hindu places only the knowledge of him by whom all else is known. And this is from an Upanishad. And the idea is what we were saying about the logos. The supreme knowledge is when we can raise our mind, consciousness, however we want to put it, to the universal mind. And then we have the knowledge of the logos, in a sense. And all else is a secondary knowledge. It's a description that, if taken correctly, will help us eventually to be able to perceive truth in a direct way. So then Annie Besant says, when one's supreme knowledge has been attained and illumination has been experienced, all scriptures become useless. What need of scriptures to those to whom the self is revealed? So the idea here again is that the text in itself, the words in a text, do not have an absolute value. Sometimes in Western religion we have far more dependence on the text, like saying these are the words of God, and we tend to regard the words, because they are supposed to come from God, as a supreme authority. Here in Hinduism, that is not the case. Words, whether they come from God or from a person, they are words. Of course, they may be a better description of reality or a worse description of reality, but they are still a description. And once we see by ourselves, then what is the value of descriptions? And then she says that a similar attitude is in Buddhism. She says in the early days of Buddhism, the Vedas too were held in high place. Remember that the Buddha was a Hindu and he practiced with Hindus and he preached to Hindus. Buddhism as a religion happened several centuries after the Buddha. So even in his day, the Buddha and the followers held the Vedas in high regard, but the character of intellectual freedom for Buddhists is contained in the wise advice of their teacher. And this is a quote that is quite famous from the Buddha. Do not believe in a thing said merely because it is said, nor in traditions because they have been handed down from antiquity, nor in writings by sages merely because sages wrote them. We are to believe when the writing, doctrine, or saying is corroborated by our own reason and consciousness. For this I have taught you, not to believe merely because you have heard, but when you believed of your own consciousness, then to act accordingly and abundantly. This is not to say that books are useless, that written information is useless. We don't need to go to the other extreme. The Buddha is saying here that we need to work with what sages said, what traditions say, and work with it and come to our own point of view. Of course, if we look at this with prejudice, with biases, we will come to wrong conclusions. But as Annie Besant says, whenever we held the wrong idea, being mistaken is in itself the punishment for the error, because we are misinterpreting reality, and suffering comes from not understanding reality or ourselves. So there is no need to punish the error, but if we are intelligent, we will try to approach the teachings with an open mind, with intelligence, with in a serious way, and then the best that we can perceive with our work, that will make us grow, and we can go along with that until our understanding deepens. It says, we know when we become the one who knows. Yes, and that is part of the journey. And normally we start looking at all these realities as something that is outside of ourselves, descriptions of what reality is. And little by little, as we, if the descriptions of reality and of ourselves are useful or accurate to the degree that a description can be accurate, and if we work intelligently with all of this, eventually we become to be in touch not with the object of knowledge, but with the knower itself. And as I said, the knower, the essence of the knower is the divine mind. So that's ultimately the place from which illumination comes, from which wisdom, real knowledge comes. So Annie Besant is making the case of the need to relate to teachings using our own consciousness to work with the teachings and not simply taking them or rejecting them. And now she will look into three sources for spiritual teachings. The first one is what she's calling here revelation, which is a word used in religion often. So she says, what is revelation? It is communication from a being superior to humanity of facts known to himself, but unknown to those to whom he makes the revelation. Facts which they cannot reach by the exercise or the powers that they have so far evolved. These facts can be verified at any time by one who has climbed to the level of the revealer, who may be an avatara, a rishi, a founder of a religion. They speak with authority, the authority of knowledge, the one authority to which all sane people bow. So the idea is that this is what we have, from religious teachers. They teach things that they claim they know, and for the time being, we don't know that. The perception of these people are higher than what our perception can get right now. As she says there, these teachings can be verified at any time by anyone that can raise his or her consciousness to the same level. But at the beginning, in our spiritual path, we find teachings that come from a source that is superior to what we can reach at the moment. So, as she says, avatars, that means divine incarnations, or enlightened beings, founders of religions, and all these are examples of sources of revelation, information that is revealed to us from what we can call a sacred source. Again, not that that sacred source is not in us, but is not accessible at the moment. Now, she points out to something interesting. She says, we do not find that these great beings wrote down their teachings themselves. They taught, but they did not record. Some follower, some disciple, it may be after the lapse of many years or even of centuries, wrote down what he or his forefathers had heard. Hence the revelation is inevitably to some extent colored, narrowed, distorted by the transcriber. And this is very interesting because it's true. Jesus didn't write anything, the Buddha didn't write anything, Krishna didn't write anything, or we can keep on mentioning names. And I think that there must be a rule, in quotation marks, for these teachers not to put things on writing. And we will see a little why that may be the case. But what is important for us at this point is that whatever the teacher said is normally written after many years, decades, even centuries. There is a debate about how or when the Gospels were written. For example, in the case of Christianity, well, there is a debate even when Jesus lived. According to Blavatsky, Jesus lived 100 years before what we think, and that would put the writing of the Gospels about 150 years later, 200 years later. Imagine how, of course, in those early times, there was a tradition of oral teachings where people would try to commit to memory the teachings so that they can pass it on. But you can easily see how many things will be lost, how in the transmitting of what we heard from a teacher, we are necessarily passing on our understanding of what the teacher said. And the understanding that we have is far more limited than what the mind of the teacher. So there is necessarily a narrowing of that information. In Buddhism also, it is said that the sutras were written several centuries after the Buddha. So this is something that always happens with divine incarnations or with enlightened beings when they teach. Even within the Theosophical Society, there is the Mahatma letters, these letters that come from Mahatmas who are enlightened beings, but the letters were produced in a way that, although it is different from this, in essence is not all that different, because they were transmitted through people by occult means, but nevertheless they were transmitted by people, and then that transmission would shape the information that was coming, so that I think this rule of enlightened beings not writing something directly can be seen everywhere. And one can see why wouldn't an enlightened being try to record as precisely as possible what he or she was teaching? Well, the problem is a problem of dogmatism, as we are going to see. Now, Annie Besant says this doesn't mean that the original teachings are lost. She says that which was heard originally by those around the divine teacher exists indeed in the Akashic records. You know, the idea of the Akashic records is that is the memory of nature, and may ever be recovered thence by those who have developed the inner sense by which those records may be read. I have to say here that the Theosophical concept of the Akashic records is not quite the same as the New Age concept of it. The New Age concept of the Akashic records is something that is far lower in a sense. Like everybody, you close your eyes, you hear or imagine that you hear something and you are reading the Akashic records. In the Theosophical view, reading the Akashic records is something that happens at very high states of consciousness, where things are understood in a way that transcends any kind of information that comes through the senses, because it is understood from the level of the soul. But I cannot go. I actually gave a lecture that is on YouTube somewhere about the Akashic records and the difference between the original Theosophical teaching, because it was Theosophists that coined this term Akashic record, and then how the teaching is popularized later on. But in any case, the idea is that all this information is still there, available for those who can read the records, as Annie Besant says. In many cases, she also says, true records will have been made at the time by highly qualified persons, but such precious books are kept securely in the custody of their chosen guardians in secret temples, in rock libraries, available for the study of high occultists, but of none other. And this is something that Blavatsky also claimed, and people had a hard time understanding again. Why wouldn't the information be freely given? Isn't that what a teacher wants to do, to give the information as precisely as possible? But Blavatsky many times explained, and I think with a little experience we start agreeing with her, at least I did, that there are certain teachings which are not good to be given unless we have a certain state of consciousness that can understand them correctly. Some of the teachings that are available today in humanity are many times misinterpreted and misapplied, and end up producing more ill than good for humanity as a whole. But without going into that aspect, there is also the problem of dogmatism, fanaticism, etc. Actually, Annie Besant gives an example here, without mentioning that part of dogmatism, but I want to bring that up. But she says the Muslim would claim that in the case of their sacred book, there is more certainty that the very words of their prophet were preserved. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the idea is that the Quran are the actual words that Muhammad wrote down. During his life, he was in communication with Archangel Gabriel, who brought information from God during 20 years or so, and he wrote down the Quran. So for a Muslim, the words that are there are the words of the prophet. It's like if Jesus had written the Gospels. And then, as she says, and doubtless to this is due the overwhelming authority of Al-Quran in the minds of the faithful of Islam. And we can see how the more certain a person is about certain scriptures, the more willing that person is to become fanatical or intolerant, to go to extreme acts, because people who are really religious, if they truly believe that the Bible was written, let's suppose, in the Old Testament, there is, I think it was in Ecclesiastes, there is a part where it says, whoever disrespect his mother and father should be stoned to death. And if you think that this is something that God wrote or that Jesus wrote, well, people who are fanatical would really, say this is what we have to do and go out and stone people to death. And it's very easy throughout history for information to be distorted. For many reasons. We know it, even the scholars know how information is distorted. But also, even if it is not distorted, the descriptions can never capture the truth. Descriptions are always general. Descriptions cannot encompass all the different possibilities in each situation. Society changes, and things that could be applicable at the time may not be applicable any longer in this particular context. So it would be something very dangerous for humanity if the enlightened beings would write things down and impart this divine authority on scriptures. So I think this is part of maybe part of the reason why all these divine incarnations have not written down their teachings. Then Deborah asked, could this be like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi being found later? And yes, this is something that happens frequently once humanity matures to a certain level. Certain information is made available to humanity in different ways. Maybe by the discovery of old writings, like in the cases that Deborah is mentioning here of Gnostic Christianity, or by the incarnation of a religious teacher that brings up all that information that at this time may be useful, or by the formation of organizations, spiritual organizations. Actually, Blavatsky claimed that the Theosophical Society had been founded to bring up some of this esoteric information because her teachers, these Mahatmas, thought that humanity had grown enough to deal with this information that had been secret up to that point. So there are always ways in which the information is made available along with the growth of humanity. So then Annie Besant asks, what should be the attitude of the Theosophical student towards revelation? He should treat the scriptures of the world with reverence, remembering their origin, but none of them with submission, remembering that they are transmitted to him by varied channels. He should call to his aid the best scholarship, should gain all the light he can from archaeological and historical researches, and use his best critical judgment in separating the essential truth revealed from all the accretions that may have grown up around it. So basically, she's encouraging a critical attitude with reverence, as she says, on a background of reverence, but having a critical attitude so that we don't fall into superstition, basically. Some teachings may have a symbolic meaning, not a factual meaning. And the archaeology, scholarly research may demonstrate that some things were not factually true, but they may be even irrelevant as a fact. They may be far more meaningful as a symbolic teaching. Actually, Annie Besant wrote this book, Esoteric Christianity, where she talks about the Christ and the teachings of the Christ from a factual, mythological, and mythical point of view. So that I think is a good example of what the kind of attitude she's hinting at here. So basically with reverence, but with a critical judgment, and always try to get what is the essence that is being trying to be transmitted. Um, so that we don't confuse things that were maybe added later on, or things that were applicable to the culture of the time, but that was applicable only to that culture with the conditions that that culture was living in. And today, those things are completely out of place. And she says then, much may be done by inner unfoldment. The aspirant may unfold within himself his own spiritual powers. He may seek in profound meditation the truth which shines in the revelation beneath many a veil of ignorance and misconstruction. He may so purify his life that his bodies will become translucent to the light of the Spirit within him, will illumine the written words. The Spirit dwells in every one of us, and as his light shines out, the divine things are revealed to the pure in heart. And I think this is something quite within our reach, as we are earnest in trying to follow what we can call a spiritual life. We start having the ability to see, between the words. We start having this sense of we understand the main point here. Besides all the external images or the external appearances, there is in us a certain insight that helps us see the core of the teaching. And that is all part of our ability to connect to the true knowledge, so that the words that we see in a scripture are just a bridge, something that stimulates in us to connect our mind to the original facts that this is describing. So that this is something that I think, little by little, any earnest person begins to see in himself or herself the ability to perceive the essence of things. So this, of course, helps us in studying the teachings of Buddha or Jesus or whoever it is. We can do it with a critical attitude. By critical, I don't mean an attitude of opposition, but an attitude of thinking about things, trying to see what is true and what is not, and with the aid of our own spiritual intuition. So then she says, until the inner spirit thus responds to the revealed teachings and statements, the Theosophical student must hold his judgment in suspense before the claims of any revelation. It is not true for him until he can re-echo it in the voice of his own spirit, his deepest self. Useful and beautiful it may be, worthy of profoundest study and reverent research are the world's Bibles, but until they are affirmed by the Spirit within, submission cannot be yielded, lest that should be given to the errors of men, which is due only to the Divine Spirit. So basically it's the same. We can study with reverence, but don't take blindly what it says there, because you never know if what you are taking for granted comes from the Spirit or is part of the misinterpretation. So with the earnest work, this spiritual intuition begins to be more and more available, and then we acquire that ability to sense the truth behind the statements. So that in regards to the revelation. What about inspiration? She says, what is inspiration? It is the raising of the normal human faculties by some extraneous influence through grade after grade of intellectual, moral, and spiritual power, the raising of the powers of the subject from above their normal capacity to the highest point of their possible exercise. So we'll see what all this means, but basically what she's saying is that it's the raising of the normal human faculties. So we have a certain ability to understand. There is a raising of our ability to see, to understand, by some external influence, a divine influence in the case that we are talking about, so that the person, suppose a prophet, for example. A prophet could be a good example of this, in which it is not a divine incarnation that is speaking directly, but because of a divine influence, the prophet can see things that without that influence he or she couldn't. So inspiration is always done through a human being, and this external influence raises that human being to as much as that human being can be raised. In the Theosophical view, there are no miracles. When a person may be inspired, but the external influence cannot eradicate the limitations intrinsic in the person. If that happens, then we would come to more of the situation of the revelation. It's not the person any longer talking, but the divine. But basically, the idea is, in this case, a person that is raised in his or her capacity to see and to transmit what is seen. So she says, the lower grades of inspiration are within the experience of very many. Have you never felt, when listening to a speaker whose knowledge and power transcended your own, that your mental faculties were lifted to a higher level than that to which you could rise unaided? On such occasions, you grasp questions that hitherto have eluded you. You see plainly, where before there had been obscurity. The field of thought becomes illumined. You feel that you know. On the following day, you desire to share with a friend the treasures that you acquired, but you fail. Where is the light? Your mind has sunk again to its normal level. The inspiration has passed away. So this is something that happens very frequently. And, it happens not only with spiritual activities. It may happen also emotionally or merely intellectually. Annie Besant will explain a little the mechanism. But basically is that an external influence can raise our consciousness to levels that we normally do not when we are by ourselves. She says, for example, as with the intellectual, so with the moral faculties. You had seen an unknown beauty, had felt an overwhelming admiration for the lofty and the pure. What has become of the warmth, the ardor? Why does it now look so cold, so gray, so unattractive? You were raised to a higher level than you can reach unassisted. And this sometimes happens, as she is going to say, this can happen when we read a book, when for whatever reason external conditions may be right, and we have insights that then we cannot attain in any normal condition. All this is not lost, as she's going to point out. It does have an effect even if we cannot remain in that high state of consciousness, but eventually that will become our normal state of consciousness. So she says, nonetheless, even though this inspiration has ended, the moral ideal and its power has been shown to you, and the fact that you have once experienced its all-compelling power will render you more susceptible to it in the future. and the day will come when that which you felt when inspired by another shall become the normal exercise of your own moral faculties. So this is what I was saying. Every time that we respond to some inspiration from whatever source, sometimes the sources are known, sometimes we don't know what the source is, but it begins to change our consciousness. It begins to make it more receptive to this. And little by little, that which happened seldom when there were right external conditions, now we begin to be able to position ourselves there, by our own will. And then little by little, that becomes our normal state of consciousness. And then it doesn't feel particularly, different, because that's what we are. Normally, we feel the difference between states when we attain a state that is not normal for us. Once that state becomes normal, the idea or the shock, the difference between states disappear, of course. So she says, in the case of those who have written or spoken under inspiration, their own characters and temperaments color what they say, leave their own impress on what they write. But they write and speak far more nobly, far more powerfully than they could do unassisted. So she goes back to the idea of a prophet or teacher, so yourself talking to a friend, whatever the case, if one is doing it as a response to some inspiration, the message that comes through the person will still be conditioned by the person's way of speaking, by even by prejudices. It depends on how deep the inspiration is, how much the past memory, experience, prejudices may taint the message that comes. Sometimes the message may be completely deformed, in a sense, maybe presented in a way that resembles little the original influence, but on many occasions is quite similar, although it takes on the peculiarities of the person that is speaking. The same influence in another person would manifest externally in a different way, although the essence of the message would be similar. And then she says, this inspiration may go deeper and deeper. It may be just at the emotional level or the mental level or the spiritual levels. And so we may rise from grade to grade of inspiration until we reach the stage at which the mind and the emotions of the person no longer sway his body, but the body is wholly taken possession of and used by one greater than himself. Then it is no longer the person who speaks, but the spirit of his Father who speaketh in him. His own limitations are struck away, his own idiosyncrasies vanish, and the inspired utterances flow forth unsullied. Then inspiration may range into revelation. That's what I was saying. At some point, this happened, for example, in the Theosophical tradition. This happened sometimes with Blavatsky, where one of the Mahatmas would speak through her. And this also happens in channeling. Now, Blavatsky would explain that there is a difference between a person being taken over by an external influence, which eclipses, which obscures the awareness of the person, and the person falls into a trance where that person doesn't know what is going on, and there is some other entity speaking through that person. That is a kind of revelation. Now, it depends on the height, the spiritual height of the entity, whether the revelation is worth paying attention or not. But it is said that it's a mechanism that is not good for the person that is serving as a channeler, because the development of the soul implies an ever expansion of awareness, implies diminishing the times in which awareness or this self-awareness is not present. So a person that trains himself or herself to lose awareness so that other entities can talk through him or her are actually going against their own evolution. Blavatsky explained that when this happens in the context of a yogi, let's say, or a person that was trained in occultism, as Blavatsky said, she says, you simply step aside of your body and you are fully aware there, and you are aware of what kind of person is talking through you. You hear what the person is saying. You could at any time intervene and take over the body again. So she says this is what happens in the cases where the master talks through me. So it's not really a kind of channeling or mediumship, which normally implies the loss of awareness of the channeler. But in those cases, as we say, then it wouldn't be inspiration any longer, it's revelation, and the message comes directly from this other entity. It's not, as Annie Besant says here, the limitations of the person that was speaking are struck away and the idiosyncrasies vanish because it's not the person any longer talking. So then she talks a little about the process. How can this inspiration happen? She says the process of all this is a very simple one. Each change in our consciousness is accompanied by a vibration of the matter that forms the body that consciousness is using. So in the case of mental consciousness, a change in mental consciousness will produce a change in the mental body, or the emotional consciousness in the emotional body, etc. But also at the same time, each vibration in the matter of the body will produce a change in the consciousness. So this happens both ways. Consciousness may produce a change in the body, or a change in the body may induce a change in consciousness. So then she says when the vibrations that are produced in the mental body, let's say, they are communicated to the mental matter that is in the atmosphere, and then cause similar vibrations in the neighboring body, in the mental body of a person that is being inspired, for example. These vibrations are immediately answered by corresponding changes in the consciousness of the person that is being inspired, and the person concerned thus placed en rapport with one more advanced, thinks, desires, and acts on a higher level than would be possible for him on his own initiative. So the person that is inspiring, these vibrations, the matter that is being set in motion, also influence the person that is being inspired, so that his or her own mental body, in this case, for example, would vibrate at the high level that the inspirer is vibrating. And then when the stimulus is removed, people gradually sink back to their normal level, but memory is left, and it is easier for them to respond the second time, and so on, until they establish themselves on the higher level permanently. Hence the value of companionship with those more advanced than ourselves, of living in their atmosphere. Words are not necessary, little speech may pass, but insensibly the subtle body is tuned to a higher key. So this is the foundation for what in Hinduism they call satsang, the idea that being in the presence of spiritual people naturally makes our own bodies to start vibrating more spiritually, and we are trained into being able to perceive things more spiritually. Now, of course, this is something that many people experienced around enlightened people, and they say when we are around we feel differently. But then if afterwards that person doesn't make an effort to maintain as much as possible that state of consciousness, then it it just disappears and it doesn't produce necessarily a lasting effect in the life of the person. But if the person, besides being related to spiritual people, also makes an effort to stay in that state as much as possible, then that is a very effective, way of growing. That in India is held in very high regard. And then Annie Besant says similar results may be brought about by reading the writings of those who are more evolved than we are. A similar series of changes is set up, though less powerfully than by the living presence. However, intent and reverent study may attract the attention of the writer, whether he be in or out of the body, and may draw him to the student, and thus cause the latter to be enveloped in his atmosphere quite as potently as though he were physically present. Hence the value of reading noble literature. We are keyed up to its level for the time, and such reading, steadily persevered in, will lift us to a higher level and establish us thereon. This is a very important concept from an occult perspective. Blavatsky talked about this several times. Whenever we read something, we connect, because on the inner planes there is no separation of space. Whenever we read something, we start getting connected to the consciousness of that person. Whether that person is alive or dead, so-called dead, the consciousness of the person is always somewhere on the inner planes. And what brings you close to something on the inner planes is just the affinity. So when we read something that, say, because we are in a theosophical context, what Blavatsky wrote or what Besant wrote, or any spiritual person, if we do it as she's saying here, steadily, with perseverance, if we do it in a constant way, little by little we start getting in touch with the actual consciousness of the person, and that begins to accelerate our understanding and allows us to see deeper in ways that it wouldn't happen. So many times when we are studying books, we are not really learning from the concepts. We are learning from getting in touch with that kind of knowledge, at an inner level, not merely from the intellectual concepts that we read. Of course, for this purpose, the study has to be done in a meditative way, in an earnest way. If our study is only intellectual, we will just get in touch with thought forms, with ideas that have been produced in connection to that subject. But if our intent is more spiritual, then the connection will happen on a spiritual level too. And then she says, hence the value of brief reading before meditation, lifting us into an air more favorable to the work of meditation than we can start from unassisted. Hence the value also of holy places for such meditation, places where the atmosphere is literally vibrating at a higher rate than our own, and hence the advice so often given by the instructed to keep, if possible, a room or closet set apart for meditation, such a place soon gaining an atmosphere purer and subtler than that of the surrounding world. It is of little use for the theosophical student to be acquainted with these laws if he does not utilize them to his own helping and to the helping of those around him. So this is the foundation of how environment, places, people, readings, they all can become sources of inspiration and can help us see things in a higher way than we could in other circumstances. And little by little, that becomes, as we said, our regular state of consciousness. So what is the attitude towards inspiration? What should be the attitude of the theosophical student towards the inspired person or the inspired book? He should be receptive, stilling all his normal vibrations so far as is possible, and opening his whole nature to the impact and influx of the waves of vibration that pour forth upon him. But his attitude should be more than receptive. He should gently endeavor to attune himself and to cooperate with the inflowing waves. For this, he must pour out to the inspiring object of his love, his trust, his complete confidence and self-surrender, for thus only can he attune his bodies into sympathy with those of the inspirer. He must, for the time, empty himself of his own ideas, his own feelings, his own activities, surrendering himself to reproduce and not to initiate vibrations. So this reminds me a lot. Sometimes Krishnamurti would start his lecture saying, how do we listen? Are we listening with our minds constantly comparing or arguing? Are we listening, from our prejudices or memory? Or can we listen with this kind of attitude, an attitude of complete attention, of openness, of being in touch and in sympathy with the book or the person speaking, and that's how we can heighten the effect of the inspiration. As Annie Besant says here, we do that for the time being. This is where we are gathering, or where we are allowing a higher point of view to come. Then after that is done, we can always have the same attitude that she was talking about revelation. We can start working with that information and seeing, how much we understand, how much we really see, in what aspects we don't understand. The critical attitude is part of the growth. But at the moment of reading the book, or in the presence of a person that may be inspiring, we can leave all that aside for the time being and let the inspiration come, so that we can attain the highest perception that we can, and then we work on that, on a second stage of the process, let's say. So she says, if we are going to read one of the inspired books of the world, The Imitation of Christ, The Golden Verses of Pythagoras, Light on the Path, The Voice of the Silence, it is well to preface the reading with a prayer, if that be your habitual way of raising your consciousness to its highest mood, or with the repetition of a mantra, or the soft chanting of some familiar and beloved rhythm, in order to bring yourself into a sympathetic condition. Then read a phrase, reread, brood over it, savor it mentally, suck out its essence, its life. Priceless is the value of inspired books. They are steps of a ladder set up between earth and heaven. So this is the idea of how to deal with inspired information. And then the last thing is how to deal with a third kind of books, that is what Annie Besant calls observation. She says, there remains a third class of books worthy of the attention of the Theosophical student, but towards which his attitude should be entirely different from those which he adopts towards the revealed and the inspired books. These are books containing the observations of students more advanced than himself, observations made by students who are evolving in knowledge of and in power on those planes and have not yet reached the stature of a perfect human. So as we are going to see, she's referring here to researches on inner planes that we may not have the ability to perceive at this point, that these people can, but this is information that is gathered from their observations, that may or may not be correct. We'll see a little more of this. She says, the books I have in mind are those written by disciples using their own normal faculties, faculties still in the course of evolution, books relating chiefly to the astral, mental, and Buddhic planes, to the constitution of human beings, to the past of individuals, nations, races, and worlds. We are gradually accumulating a large amount of literature of this kind, a literature of observations by students using superphysical faculties. With regards to this, certain things need to be borne in mind. So she's talking about books that of the kind that she and Leadbeater produced. For example, they researched into what is called occult chemistry. They looked at the atoms and elements from using their clairvoyant powers, or looked in the past how humanity started, etc., or the characteristics of the astral plane and the mental plane. So these are like, if they were scientific research, they are what Blavatsky used to call the occult science. It's an extension of science, and these are observations, which Annie Besant says we have to take in a different way than the way we take books that come from revelation or inspiration. She says, first, the students in question are in the course of evolution, and the faculties of which they make use today, which have become their normal faculties, are more developed and reach higher planes than those which they used 10 or 15 years ago. Hence, they see now very much more than they saw then, both in quality and quality, and this enlarged sight must inevitably give reports differing in fullness from that of the earlier and narrower vision. So part of what she's going to present is that all these observations are conditioned by the state at the moment. So what, for example, she doesn't mention this, but it's basically what they said in the earlier books. Many of those things were corrected by themselves in later books, and logically we can infer that if they had had more time to research on this, then corrections would be made on those things that they published later too. Secondly, this greater fullness of vision will change relative proportions and perspective. A thing which seemed imposing and independent when seen alone may become subordinate and comparatively insignificant when seen as part of a larger whole. So they may be seeing something, and when you see only that, you describe it as being very important because that's the only thing you see in that particular phenomena, for example. Then when you see more, you may discover that, well, that is not even all that important. In the larger context, is a part of it, but there are many other things that are more important. And then she gives an example in connection to the physical side. She says, that which to the physical eye is a globe sailing through space, a planet, let's say, becomes the free end of a continuous body materially attached to the sun when seen with superphysical sight. Was it false to describe it as a globe? Yes and no. It was and is a globe on the physical plane, answering to all that is meant by a globe down here, but in subtler regions it is not a globe, but a body, the tip of which is a globe only to gross vision, vision to which its continuation is invisible. So when you look at the planets from, with superphysical sight, you see like arms coming from the sun, and what we call the planet is like, the tip of that arm. So she gives this as an example. If you see it on one level, you talk about a globe. You see it in another level, you will describe it differently. If you see it in a even deeper level, you probably will describe it differently. So all these books of observation had to be taken as a description from a certain point of view. And then she says, thirdly, the keener vision detects intermediate stages before unseen, and shows a series of changes between two which, to less acute sight, were in immediate sequence. Thus, in the earlier observations, it was said that the ultimate physical atom broke up into astral matter. When a similar phenomenon is studied 12 years later, it is seen that the physical atom breaks up into an immense number of inconceivably minute particles, and that these immediately group themselves into 49 astral atoms. So this is just an example of what they said in occult chemistry. They thought, you break up the physical atom and then you have astral atoms, and then 12 years later, they see that there is an intermediate state where all that generates these little particles that are not astral, and then they form the astral atoms. It's not that this example is particularly important. These are examples of how observations change with the deepening of a faculty. So all this comes to this conclusion. She says, are then books relating to observations useless? They only become useless, even mischievous, when the Theosophical student treats them as revelations or inspirations instead of as observations. Observation is the basis of scientific knowledge. The correction of earlier observations by later ones is the condition of scientific progress. The student does not conclude that the conflicting observations make the observations useless. He submits the observations to renewed experiment and to the scrutiny of reason until from the contradictions emerges the many-sided truth. So in many of the Theosophical teachings there are explanations of what happens after death, or what's the structure of the inner bodies, or what is this or that. And some people tend to take this as absolute facts, as revelations, as Annie Besant says there. And we should not take them as that. We should take them as partial observations, which, just like in science, these were researched by people who were developing their higher senses, and these are partial descriptions. We can take whatever is useful from them. There is no need to discard them because there is some truth there, but there is no need to take them as divine knowledge. So she says that we should have a scientific attitude about this. To all such books, she says, you must take up the attitude of the scientific student, not of the believer. You must bring to bear upon them a bright intelligence, a keen mind, an eager intellect, a thoughtful and critical reason. You must not accept as final observations made by other students, even though those students are using faculties which you yourselves have not as yet developed. You should accept them only for what they are, observations liable to modification, to correction, to review. Study these books, but do not swallow them. Understand them, but hold your judgment in suspense. These books are useful servants, but dangerous masters. They are to be studied, not worshipped. Make your own opinions, do not borrow those of others. Do not be in such a hurry to know that you accept other people's knowledge for ready-made opinions. If they illuminate obscurities, if they conduce to sound morality, take them and use them, but never let them become fetters to your mind. And the last one, there is a dangerous tendency to make books of observations authoritative instead of using them as materials for study. We must not add to the number of blind believers who already exist, but to the number of sane and sober students who patiently form their own opinions and educate their own faculties. Let us ever be ready to correct a mistaken impression or an imperfect observation, to walk with open eyes and mind alert, remembering that the best service to truth is examination. So this is the end of the class today. I think this sets the foundation for how to deal with all the information that we are going to read about the higher life, and that it's basically, I think, encapsulates the theosophical spirit regarding study, which is an important part of the spiritual life in the theosophical tradition. Not the only one, the only aspect of the spiritual life, but it's an important part.